He left his family behind, chasing a life of luxury with his mistress. But years later, the ones he abandoned came back stronger, delivering a revenge so shocking he never saw it coming. The grand estate of the Lockwood family stood as a symbol of wealth and prestige, a sprawling mansion with its towering columns and meticulously maintained gardens. It was a place that embodied success, at least to those who saw it from the outside. To the world, Jonathan Lockwood was a man who had it all: business acumen, a reputation built on power, and a family that seemed picture perfect. His wife Eleanor had stood by his side for over 15 years, weathering every storm, building their life together, and raising their 2 children, Nicholas and Olivia. But behind the extravagant walls of the Lockwood estate, the foundation of their family had already begun to crumble. Jonathan had changed over the years. The man Eleanor had fallen in love with, the one who once held her hand through sleepless nights when Nicholas was a sickly infant, the man who had once written love letters when he traveled for work, had vanished. In his place stood a businessman consumed by ambition, obsessed with appearances, and most of all, infatuated with something, or rather, someone else. It had started subtly: late nights at the office that turned into weekends away, business trips that conveniently lacked any communication. Eleanor, always intuitive, had sensed something was wrong long before the truth emerged. She had asked him once gently, not out of suspicion but out of concern, "Jonathan, are we okay?" She had whispered one night as they lay in bed, their bodies a million miles apart even though they were inches away. He had sighed, rolling over without so much as looking at her. "You worry too much, Eleanor. My company is expanding. I don't have time to coddle insecurities." It was the first crack. The second came when she found the first receipt, a dinner for 2 at an upscale restaurant she had never been to. Then there were whispers in their social circles, exchanged glances at charity galas, where Jonathan arrived alone. Eleanor knew before she even confirmed it, but nothing prepared her for the truth. The confirmation came on an ordinary afternoon. Eleanor had planned a surprise lunch at Jonathan's office, something she hadn't done in years. The kids had urged her to do something special, hoping it would bring their father back home more often. But when she arrived at his sleek high-rise building, the receptionist had given her a look of discomfort. "Mrs. Lockwood," she had said hesitantly. "Mr. Lockwood just stepped out. He's at the Peninsula Hotel for a private meeting." Eleanor had felt her heart drop to her stomach. At that moment, standing in the center of the office she had once been so proud of, she made the decision to see the truth with her own eyes. The ride to the hotel felt like an eternity, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Every part of her wanted to be wrong, wanted this to be some misunderstanding. But when she arrived at the Grand Hotel and saw him stepping out of the car, his hand resting on the lower back of a woman half her age, Eleanor felt her world tilt. She was stunning, long legs, golden curls cascading down her back, lips painted in a shade too bold for someone who wasn't seeking attention. She was laughing at something Jonathan had said, tilting her head in a way that made her seem effortlessly charming. Eleanor didn't cry, she didn't scream. She simply turned around and walked away. That night she didn't confront him. She waited, she observed, and when he came home, smelling like a different perfume, acting as if nothing had changed, Eleanor made a vow to herself. She would not beg, she would not plead. If Jonathan wanted to throw away his family, she wouldn't stop him, but she would make sure that when he realized his mistake, it would be far too late. Eleanor sat in the dimly lit kitchen, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound breaking the silence of the night. The house, once filled with warmth and laughter, now felt like an empty shell. Jonathan had not come home again, and she didn't need to wonder where he was. She already knew. The weight of the knowledge pressed against her chest, but she refused to let herself crumble. If Jonathan thought he could discard her and their family like an outdated business deal, he was gravely mistaken. She had spent the last few weeks carefully collecting evidence. She wasn't a woman who acted on emotion alone. Jonathan had taught her that much. While he had been out whining and dining his mistress, Eleanor had been busy. She had gone through every financial statement, tracked every transaction, and gathered every receipt. She had seen the hotel bookings, the private dinners, the extravagant gifts. Each piece of evidence was like a dagger to her heart, but she refused to let the pain consume her. She had children to protect, Nicholas and Olivia had already sensed something was wrong. Nicholas, at 16, had become more reserved, his once playful demeanor replaced with brooding silence. Olivia, 12, was more direct, asking outright why their father never seemed to have time for them anymore. "Mom," Olivia asked one night as she sat at the kitchen counter swinging her legs, "did I do something wrong?" Eleanor's heart clenched. "Of course not, sweetheart. Why would you ask that?" Olivia shrugged. "Dad doesn't come home much, and when he does, he doesn't really talk to me. He used to help me with my homework. He used to take us out for ice cream. Now it's like he's always busy." Eleanor fought the lump in her throat. "He loves you," she said carefully. "He's just—" She searched for words that wouldn't taint Olivia's perception of her father. "Distracted." Nicholas, who had been sitting across from them, scoffed. "You mean he doesn't care?" Eleanor shot him a warning look. "Nicholas." But he didn't back down. His dark eyes, so much like his father's, were hard and unyielding. "I'm not a kid, Mom. I see it. I hear things at school. People talk." Eleanor stiffened. "What do you mean?" Nicholas hesitated, then sighed. "Dad's been seen around town with some woman. She's younger. She's pretty. Everyone knows." Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, willing herself to stay composed. She had tried to shield her children from the ugly truth, but the world had a cruel way of revealing things. "Your father loves you," she said, forcing the words out. Nicholas let out a bitter laugh. "Number he loves himself." Eleanor said nothing, because deep down she knew he was right. The confrontation came sooner than she expected. Jonathan waltzed in late one night, the scent of expensive perfume clinging to his suit. Eleanor was waiting. "You're late," she said simply. He loosened his tie, unfazed. "Work ran long." She folded her arms. "You were with her." Jonathan stilled. "I saw you," she continued, "at the peninsula. You weren't exactly discreet." He sighed, rubbing his temple. "Eleanor." "No." Her voice was sharp. "No excuses. No lies." Jonathan let out another sigh, this time as if she were an inconvenience. "Eleanor, our marriage hasn't been working for years. We both know that." She scoffed. "Funny how you didn't mention that before." His jaw tightened. "I didn't intend for you to find out this way, but yes, I've met someone else." Eleanor's fingers curled into fists. "She makes me happy," he continued, as if that was supposed to justify his betrayal, "and I think it's time we both moved on." She stared at him, unable to believe the casual way he was dismantling their family. "And what about Nicholas? Olivia?" Jonathan finally had the decency to look uncomfortable. "We'll figure something out. I'll provide for them, of course." Eleanor laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Oh, how generous of you." "I'm not the villain here," he snapped. "I deserve happiness too." Her expression hardened. "Happiness?" "Yes," he said, straightening his shoulders. "I've given everything to this family, to you, and now I need something for myself." Eleanor felt something inside her snap. "You gave everything?" she repeated, her voice dangerously low. "Who supported you when you had nothing? Who stood by your side when you were just a struggling entrepreneur with a dream? Who raised your children while you worked late nights? Who built this life with you?" Jonathan shifted uncomfortably. "Eleanor, let's not do this." "No," she cut him off. "Let's, because I want you to remember every single thing I've done for you when you realize what you've lost." Jonathan pinched the bridge of his nose. "This is exactly why we don't work. You're always looking for a fight." She stepped closer, her voice steady. "And you're always looking for an escape." A silence stretched between them. Eleanor inhaled sharply, then exhaled. "You want out," she finally said. "Fine." For the first time that night, Jonathan looked surprised. "Fine," she nodded. "Fine, but don't think for 1 second that I will let you walk away with everything." He scoffed. "Eleanor, let's be civil about this." "Oh, we will be," she said, "and you'll regret it." His brows furrowed. "What does that mean?" She smiled. "You'll find out soon enough." And with that, she turned on her heel and walked away, leaving Jonathan standing alone. He thought he had won, but he was about to learn that the real battle hadn't even begun. Jonathan moved out the next week. He told the kids it was for the best that he and their mother had grown apart. Nicholas refused to look at him. Olivia cried. Eleanor stood there, her expression unreadable. "You'll still see me," Jonathan promised them. "I'll come by." Nicholas scoffed. "Sure, until your new life gets in the way." Jonathan sighed. "That's not fair." Nicholas's gaze was ice. "Neither is what you did." Jonathan flinched. Eleanor stepped forward, placing a hand on her son's shoulder. Enough! Nicholas clenched his jaw but said nothing. Jonathan hesitated. Eleanor. She tilted her head. What? For a moment he looked like he wanted to say something. Apologize, maybe. But then he shook his head. Nothing. Eleanor smiled faintly. That's right. You have nothing left to say. Jonathan frowned but didn't argue. And with that he walked out the door, believing he had left them behind. But what he didn't know, what he could never predict, was that the people he abandoned would one day rise stronger than ever. And when they did, he would be the one left in the dust. Eleanor stared at the closed door, the echo of Jonathan's departure lingering in the air like a heavy fog. The house, once filled with laughter and warmth, felt like an abandoned battlefield. She had expected the pain, braced herself for the reality of life without him, but nothing could have prepared her for the emptiness. She turned to her children. Olivia sat curled up on the couch, hugging a pillow to her chest, her little face streaked with tears. Nicholas stood near the staircase, his hands clenched into fists, his jaw tight. She had never seen so much anger in his eyes before. I hate him, Nicholas muttered, his voice low but laced with venom. Don't say that, Eleanor said instinctively, though a part of her understood his rage. Nicholas shook his head. He didn't just leave you, he left us. What kind of father does that? Eleanor didn't have an answer. Olivia sniffled. Is he ever coming back? Eleanor knelt beside her, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. He'll visit, she said, though even she didn't believe the words. Olivia wiped her nose on her sleeve. I don't want him to. Eleanor's heart broke all over again. This wasn't just about her pain. Jonathan hadn't only betrayed his wife, he had shattered their family. But Eleanor refused to let him have the final say in how their story ended. The next few months were a blur of adjustments. Jonathan moved into a sleek, high-rise apartment in the city, where he openly flaunted his new relationship with a younger woman named Celeste. Eleanor had known about Celeste long before Jonathan admitted to the affair. She was a 20-something socialite, the kind of woman who thrived on attention and luxury. The tabloids were eating up their relationship, splashing their faces across magazine covers with headlines like, Billionaire's New Love, Inside the Scandalous Split. Eleanor refused to acknowledge it. Instead, she focused on rebuilding. She threw herself into work, taking on more clients, networking tirelessly, and slowly regaining her independence. Jonathan had assumed she would crumble without him, that she would drown in grief and self-pity. He was wrong. She was not the same woman who had built his empire by his side. She was stronger, and she was about to prove it. It started small. One evening, Nicholas barged into her home office, slamming his laptop onto the desk. Have you seen this? He demanded, his voice tight with frustration. Eleanor sighed. What now? Nicholas turned the screen toward her, revealing an article featuring Jonathan and Celeste at some high-profile event. Jonathan Ashford and his stunning girlfriend steal the spotlight. Sources say wedding bells are near. Eleanor felt the familiar sting in her chest, but she pushed it aside. Let them have their spotlight, she said coolly. Nicholas scowled. How can you be this calm? Eleanor met his gaze. Because I refuse to let them dictate my happiness. Nicholas clenched his jaw. Mom, he's getting away with it. He left us and now he's living like nothing happened. Eleanor exhaled. He hasn't gotten away with anything. Nicholas frowned. What does that mean? Eleanor smiled faintly. It means his happiness is an illusion. People like him, people who build their lives on betrayal, never find true peace. Nicholas crossed his arms. That's not enough. Eleanor studied him. What do you want, Nicholas? Revenge? He hesitated. I want him to see what he lost. Eleanor nodded slowly. Then let's make sure we give him something to regret. Eleanor's first move was reclaiming herself. She had spent years in the shadow of Jonathan's success, playing the role of the devoted wife, always standing in the background while he took center stage. That was over. She rebranded herself, launching a new business venture focused on helping women navigate financial independence after divorce. Her name, Eleanor Ashford, began making waves in the industry. At first, Jonathan didn't pay attention. Then the media started noticing. Eleanor Ashford, from betrayed wife to powerhouse entrepreneur. Jonathan Ashford's ex is thriving, and she's not looking back. Jonathan saw the headlines, but he brushed them off. Until she became the one getting invited to elite business gatherings. Until she became the woman everyone admired. until people started saying her name before his. It was Nicholas who first noticed the shift. At one of his school events, a well-known businessman approached him. "You must be Eleanor Ashford's son," the man said, shaking his hand. "Your mother is an inspiration." Nicholas smirked. "Yeah, she is." And for the first time in months, he felt proud again. The moment Eleanor knew she had truly won was at a charity gala. Jonathan and Celeste had been parading around, basking in the attention, assuming they were the center of it all. Then Eleanor walked in. She was radiant in an elegant midnight blue gown, confidence radiating from her like a force field. And the whispers began. "That's Eleanor Ashford. She looks incredible. She's been doing amazing things lately." Jonathan turned, his eyes locking onto her. And for the first time in years, Eleanor saw it. Regret. Celeste clung to his arm, but it didn't matter, because Jonathan wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the woman he had left behind. And Eleanor smiled, not because she wanted him back, but because she knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that she had won. Not through revenge and not through bitterness, but by simply being better. She had taken the pain he inflicted and turned it into power. And that was something Jonathan Ashford would never be able to undo. Jonathan Ashford had always prided himself on control. Control over his business, control over his image, control over the people in his life. He had spent decades building his empire, and he believed that walking away from Eleanor had been just another calculated decision. But control was slipping through his fingers. It started with whispers. At first, they were insignificant. A passing comment here, a dismissive smirk there. But soon, Jonathan began noticing how conversations in business circles had shifted. His name, once synonymous with power, was being overshadowed by someone unexpected. Eleanor. He hadn't paid much attention at first. After all, she had always been the quiet force behind his success, managing things in the background while he handled the spotlight. But now she was thriving, and worse, people were noticing. At a private business dinner, one of his longtime associates leaned in with an amused smirk. "You've seen what Eleanor's been up to, right?" Jonathan forced a casual chuckle. "Oh, I'm sure she's keeping herself busy." The associate raised an eyebrow. "Busy? She's shaking up the industry. Her new firm has been attracting serious investors. Some of them are people we used to work with." Jonathan clenched his jaw. He hadn't realized she had gained that much traction. "Good for her," he said tightly, waving it off. But it wasn't good for him, because as much as Jonathan tried to ignore it, the headlines kept coming. Eleanor Ashford's rise from betrayed wife to business icon. The woman who lost everything and took it back. The more attention she received, the more the dynamic shifted. His empire, his power, was being questioned. And Jonathan hated it. It didn't take long for Celeste to notice the change in him. She had always been perceptive, at least when it came to things that affected her. And lately Jonathan had been distant. She caught him scrolling through news articles about Eleanor. She saw the way his jaw tensed whenever her name was mentioned in passing. One evening, while lounging in their penthouse, she finally spoke. "You're obsessed with her," she accused, sipping on an expensive glass of wine. Jonathan looked up, irritation flashing across his features. "Don't be ridiculous." Celeste smirked, setting down her glass. "Then why do you keep checking her updates?" Jonathan exhaled sharply. "She's making moves in the business world. That affects me." Celeste rolled her eyes. "Oh, please, you're just mad she's winning." Jonathan stiffened. Winning. That word echoed in his mind, taunting him. Celeste leaned in, her voice dripping with amusement. "You thought she'd crumble without you. Instead, she became everything you underestimated." Jonathan's jaw tightened. He had walked away from Eleanor believing she was nothing without him. He had assumed she would fade into the background, a forgotten chapter in his past. Instead, she had become the main story. Jonathan wasn't the only one feeling the shift. Nicholas and Olivia, their children, had started distancing themselves from him. At first, it was subtle. Missed calls, short replies, excuses about being busy with school or work. Then it became deliberate. Olivia stopped visiting altogether. Nicholas, who had once idolized his father, barely spoke to him. And the worst part? It wasn't anger anymore, it was indifference. One afternoon, Jonathan called Nicholas. "Hey son," he said, forcing casualness into his voice. "We haven't talked in a while. Let's have dinner." Nicholas sighed on the other end of the line. "I'm busy, Dad." Jonathan frowned. "Too busy to grab a meal with your father?" There was a pause before Nicholas spoke again. You didn't care about family when you left, Dad. So why pretend now? The words hit Jonathan harder than he expected. He swallowed, his grip tightening around the phone. That's not fair. Nicholas let out a humorless chuckle. Neither was what you did to Mom. And then he hung up. Jonathan stared at the screen, his own son's words playing over and over in his mind. For the first time in years, Jonathan felt something foreign. Regret. The breaking point came at a charity event. Jonathan and Celeste had been invited to a high-profile gala, a gathering of elites, influencers, and investors. It was supposed to be his night, a chance to remind people who he was. And then Eleanor arrived. She walked in like she belonged there, her confidence undeniable. Wearing an elegant crimson gown that exuded power, she carried herself with a poise that was impossible to ignore. And Jonathan wasn't the only one staring. People gravitated toward her, eager to shake her hand, to praise her work. Jonathan clenched his fists as he watched from across the room. For years she had been in his shadow. Now he was in hers. Celeste noticed his distraction and followed his gaze. Still think leaving her was the right choice? She asked, amusement flickering in her eyes. Jonathan didn't answer, because for the first time he wasn't so sure anymore. Eleanor had no interest in speaking to Jonathan that night, but fate had other plans. As she made her way to the exit, she found herself face to face with him. Jonathan swallowed hard, taking in the woman before him. The same woman he had once dismissed, now standing tall, stronger than ever. Eleanor, he said, his voice quieter than he intended. She met his gaze, but there was nothing there. No lingering affection, no bitterness, just indifference. That hurt more than any anger ever could. I see you've been doing well, Jonathan said, forcing a smirk. Eleanor tilted her head. I have. Jonathan cleared his throat. You always had potential, you know. You just never saw it, Eleanor interrupted smoothly. Jonathan blinked. Eleanor smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. I used to wonder why you left, why I wasn't enough. But now, I realize you were the one who wasn't enough. Jonathan stiffened. Eleanor took a step forward, lowering her voice just enough for only him to hear. I built you, Jonathan, and now, you're nothing but a man struggling to keep up. Jonathan's throat went dry. Before he could respond, Eleanor turned on her heel and walked away. For the first time since he had left her, Jonathan Ashford understood something with absolute certainty. He had lost, and this time there was no going back. Jonathan Ashford sat in his office, the city lights sprawling beneath him. The skyline that once felt like his domain now seemed indifferent, distant. His entire life had been built on the idea that he was untouchable, that power, wealth, and control would always keep him ahead. But tonight, all he could think about was how wrong he had been. Eleanor's words at the gala haunted him. I built you, Jonathan, and now, you're nothing but a man struggling to keep up. It was the truth he had been avoiding for years. He had left Eleanor thinking she was replaceable, that he could upgrade to someone younger, someone who fit the image he wanted. Yet here he was, watching her succeed without him, while he stood still, feeling the first true loss of his life. Celeste, on the other hand, wasn't blind to the shift in him. She had seen the way his eyes lingered on Eleanor that night. She had noticed how quiet he had been on the way home, how the usual confidence he carried had cracked, and Celeste didn't like it one bit. She was not about to let Jonathan start regretting, not when she had sacrificed too much to be here. One evening, she confronted him in their penthouse, arms crossed, her voice laced with irritation. You've been acting strange, she said, narrowing her eyes. Don't tell me you're suddenly missing your ex-wife. Jonathan sighed, rubbing his temples. Celeste, don't start. Celeste scoffed. Oh, please, I saw the way you looked at her. It's pathetic. Jonathan shot her a warning look. Watch it. But Celeste wasn't afraid of him, not anymore. She crossed the room, sitting on the edge of the couch, her legs crossed, her nails tapping against her wine glass. You thought I didn't know, she smirked. You still check her social media. You keep up with her business. You're obsessed with her success. Jonathan clenched his jaw. I'm not obsessed with her. Celeste laughed. Then why do you care so much? He had no answer for that, because he did care, not just about Eleanor's success, but about what it said about him. He had left her behind, assuming he was upgrading. But now it felt like he was the one who had been left behind. Celeste sighed dramatically, standing up. You should be grateful, Jonathan. I gave you a new life, a younger, sexier woman. No baggage, No kids weighing you down. You're living the dream, remember? Jonathan exhaled sharply. I'm not having this conversation. Celeste stepped closer, tilting her head. Then let's talk about something else, she whispered. Like how your business is tanking. Jonathan froze. Celeste's lips curled into a smirk. Oh, you didn't think I noticed? His grip tightened around the armrest of the chair. What are you talking about? Celeste shrugged. You don't think I pay attention to the market? Your shares have been slipping. Investors are jumping ship and, oh, she smiled sweetly. I heard Eleanor's company just signed a huge deal with one of your old partners. Jonathan's stomach twisted. She wasn't wrong. Eleanor had taken what he built and turned it into something better. The next few weeks only made things worse. Jonathan's business troubles became impossible to ignore. Investors who once fought to be in his circle were now avoiding him. Jonathan, it's just business. We've decided to go in another direction. I think Eleanor's vision is more in line with the market's needs. Eleanor's vision. The woman he had once dismissed was now his greatest competitor. Jonathan hated it. But what he hated even more, he had done this to himself. He had been so sure that Eleanor needed him, that she would never be able to stand on her own. Yet here she was, thriving while he struggled to keep up. And that's when Jonathan realized something even worse. He had been so focused on leaving Eleanor behind that he had never truly built anything without her. She had been the silent force behind their empire. She had been the foundation. And now that she was gone, everything was collapsing. Meanwhile, Eleanor had moved on. She had spent years rebuilding her life, regaining the confidence that Jonathan had stripped from her, and she wasn't looking back. But then, one day, she got an unexpected call from Nicholas. Her son's voice was tense. Mom, Dad wants to meet. Eleanor's brows furrowed. Jonathan? Nicholas hesitated. He's not doing great. Eleanor sighed. Jonathan Ashford, the man who once had everything, was finally feeling the consequences of his choices. But did she owe him anything? Did she even want to see him? Her answer was clear. No. Nicholas exhaled. I figured, but I told him I'd ask. Eleanor softened. You did the right thing, but Nicholas, don't let him drag you into his mess. He made his choices. Nicholas was silent for a moment before he whispered, I think he regrets them. Eleanor paused. For a second, a part of her wondered if that was true. Did Jonathan really regret it? Or did he just hate losing? Either way, it wasn't her problem anymore. And for the first time in years, Eleanor felt completely free. Jonathan sat in his office, staring at his phone. Nicholas had called an hour ago. Eleanor wasn't coming. Jonathan's throat tightened. He had spent so many years thinking he could always win, that he could walk away from things without consequences. But now, for the first time, he felt something he had never truly felt before. Loss. Not just of his company, not just of his reputation, but of the one woman who had actually cared about him. He had chosen to leave her behind. And now she was gone for good. And he was completely, utterly alone. Jonathan sat in his office, staring out at the city skyline that once felt like it belonged to him. Now, it seemed indifferent, like an empire that had turned its back on its fallen king. The leather chair beneath him no longer carried the same weight of power. The walls of his office, once filled with the energy of a thriving business, now felt like a prison. The phone calls from investors had stopped. The congratulatory messages had disappeared. His bank account was still heavy, but his reputation, ruined. And worse, his pride, the thing that had always kept him at the top, was now his greatest enemy. Eleanor didn't even care enough to hate him anymore. She hadn't answered his calls. She hadn't even acknowledged him at the gala. And the more Jonathan thought about it, the more it burned. He had spent years believing that Eleanor would always be there, that she would always love him, always hold on to the past just enough to give him an opening if he ever needed one. But that opening, it was gone. She had moved on, and Jonathan, he was sinking. Celeste was growing more impatient by the day. What are you going to do about this, Jonathan? She snapped one evening, pacing across the living room of their penthouse. Jonathan barely looked up from his drink. About what? Celeste scoffed. About the fact that your company is dying and your ex-wife is thriving? People are talking, Jonathan. You look like a fool. Jonathan sighed. What do you want me to do, Celeste? Celeste narrowed her eyes. I don't know, maybe fight for what's yours. He leaned back against the couch, swirling the glass in his hand. I don't think it's mine anymore. Celeste stiffened. For the first time, real fear crossed her face. Are you giving up? She asked quietly. Jonathan looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time he realized something. Celeste didn't love him. She loved what he could offer her. The power, the money, the status. And now that those things were slipping, so was her patience. I don't know, Jonathan admitted. Celeste exhaled sharply, running a hand through her perfectly styled hair. Well, that's just great, she muttered. I didn't sign up for this, Jonathan. Jonathan smirked bitterly. No, I imagine you didn't. Celeste shot him a sharp look. What's that supposed to mean? Jonathan shrugged, standing up and downing the rest of his drink. It means maybe you should start looking for an exit strategy while you still can. Celeste's jaw clenched. For a brief second, guilt flickered in her expression, but it was gone just as quickly. And Jonathan knew she wouldn't stay, because Celeste wasn't Eleanor. Eleanor had built with him. Celeste had only been there to enjoy the rewards, and now that the rewards were running out, she would leave just as easily as she had entered his life. A week later, she was gone. Jonathan returned home one evening to find the penthouse emptier. A note sat on the kitchen counter, written in Celeste's delicate handwriting. Jonathan, I hope you understand. You're not the man I thought you were, and I'm not the kind of woman who waits for someone to rebuild what's already been lost. He stared at the words for a long time, and then he laughed. Because, of course, this was how it ended. He had abandoned Eleanor, believing he was choosing a better life. He had humiliated her, broken her, and moved on without a second thought. And now, he was the one being abandoned. He was the one left behind. The next few weeks were hell. His company was still struggling. Investors had backed out of multiple projects. His competitors, including Eleanor, were eating up the market share he once dominated. And now, whispers were starting to spread. Jonathan Ashford isn't what he used to be. He's lost his edge. Without Eleanor, he's just another fallen billionaire. Jonathan tried to ignore it. He tried to drown it out with work, with more deals, with late nights and whiskey bottles. But no matter how much he fought, he couldn't deny the truth. He had peaked the day he left Eleanor, and she had peaked the day she left him behind. One evening, after yet another failed meeting, Jonathan found himself parked outside an unfamiliar house. It was Eleanor's, or rather, her new home. A stunning estate outside the city, far more beautiful than the house they had once shared. Jonathan sat there, staring through the windshield, wondering if she was inside, wondering if she was happy, and wondering if she ever thought about him. A movement in the driveway caught his eye, and then his heart stopped, because standing there under the soft glow of the porch light was Eleanor, smiling, laughing, and beside her, a man. Jonathan felt like he had been punched in the gut. He didn't recognize him, didn't know his name, but he knew what he was seeing. Eleanor had moved on, truly, completely, and she wasn't looking back. Jonathan gripped the steering wheel, his jaw tight, his knuckles white, and for the first time in years he let himself feel the loss. Because it was real now. Not just in business, not just in reputation, but in life. He had lost the one person who had ever truly mattered, and there was no going back. Jonathan Ashford drove away that night knowing one thing for certain. Eleanor had won. She had built herself into something stronger, something unshakable. And he was nothing but the man who let her go. Jonathan Ashford had always been a man in control. He had built empires, shaped industries, and commanded rooms with nothing more than his presence. But now he sat alone in his penthouse, a hollow shell of the man he once was. The once grand and extravagant space felt empty, devoid of the warmth it used to carry. Eleanor's absence was a ghost that haunted every corner. It wasn't that she had ever lived here. No, this was the home Jonathan had moved into after he discarded her. But her memory lingered, more powerful than her presence had ever been. Jonathan would have given anything to hear the sound of her laughter again, to see her sitting across from him at the dinner table, lost in conversation, her eyes full of life. But those days were gone, and no amount of regret would bring them back. The media had a field day with his downfall. The headlines were merciless. Jonathan Ashford's empire crumbles amid controversy. Eleanor Ashford, the woman who surpassed her billionaire ex-husband. Karma? Ex-wife flourishes while Jonathan struggles to stay afloat. His phone had stopped ringing. The same people who once clamored for his attention now avoided him. Clients pulled out of deals. Investors walked away. Banks hesitated to fund his projects. Jonathan Ashford, the man who once owned the world, was now fighting to survive in it. And Eleanor, she thrived. Her new company was a powerhouse in the market. The very people who had once praised Jonathan now spoke her name with admiration. She was the future, and he was the past. Late one night, Jonathan received an invitation. It was for an exclusive gala, the kind of event where only the elite gathered. 3 years ago, he would have been the center of attention. Now he debated whether he even deserved to go, but he needed to see her. One last time. The gala was held at an extravagant 5-star hotel, the kind of place Jonathan used to walk into with confidence and ease. Tonight, however, he felt like a stranger in his own world. People turned their heads when he entered. But it wasn't admiration in their eyes, it was curiosity, pity. Whispers followed him as he walked through the crowd. "That's Jonathan Ashford. I heard his company is collapsing. Isn't Eleanor's firm overtaking his?" He ignored them, because across the room he saw her, and just like that, nothing else mattered. Eleanor was radiant. Dressed in an elegant black gown, she moved with grace and confidence, her presence commanding without even trying. The years had only made her stronger, more poised, more untouchable. Jonathan's chest tightened. He had thought about her every day since their divorce, but seeing her like this, thriving, happy, glowing, was something he hadn't been prepared for. She had let go of him, and he had never let go of her. Eleanor finally noticed him. Her gaze locked onto his for the first time in years, and in that moment Jonathan felt small. There was no anger in her eyes, no resentment, just indifference. She didn't hate him, she simply didn't care. That realization hit him harder than any loss he had ever faced. Before he could think, she turned away. Just like that, as if he had never been important to her at all. Jonathan felt his chest tighten, a strange mix of regret and longing suffocating him. For years he had convinced himself that if they ever crossed paths again, there would be something left. Some emotion, some connection, some unfinished story. But there wasn't. Eleanor had moved on. And Jonathan, he was stuck in the past. As the night went on, Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling of loss. He watched Eleanor from a distance, speaking to powerful CEOs, dignitaries, and industry leaders. She belonged here. She was one of them now. And Jonathan, he was fading. He had spent years chasing wealth, power, and youth, believing that leaving Eleanor would bring him something greater. But the truth was, he had thrown away the best thing in his life. Now she was untouchable, and he was nothing. As Jonathan left the gala that night, a realization settled into his bones. There was no redemption, no grand moment of reconciliation, no second chance. He had lost her, and Eleanor Ashford would never look back. Jonathan Ashford walked through the empty streets of the city, the neon lights flickering against the damp pavement. The gala had ended, and with it, any last illusion he held of reclaiming even a fragment of his past. Eleanor was gone. Not physically, but in every way that mattered. He had spent years convincing himself that his decision to leave her was the right one, that she had been holding him back, that youth, excitement, and a new beginning with his mistress would fulfill him in ways Eleanor never could. Now, standing on the other side of that decision, he realized how wrong he had been. Jonathan returned to his penthouse, once his castle, now just a prison of regrets. He walked through the spacious living room, his footsteps echoing against the marble floors. The space felt hollow, much like his life. Everything he once believed was important, the luxury, the cars, the exclusivity, felt meaningless now, because none of it had been real. His phone buzzed, breaking the silence. A message from his assistant. "Mr. Ashford, the bank called again. They need your financial disclosures by morning. The press is already speculating about your company's liquidity issues." Jonathan exhaled sharply. The walls were closing in. His empire was crumbling, and he could no longer pretend it wasn't happening. He poured himself a drink, staring at the city skyline. The same view that once made him feel like a god now felt like a reminder of everything he had lost. His mind drifted to Eleanor. She had walked away without looking back. He had never thought it possible. Even after their divorce, a small part of him believed she still loved him, that if he ever wanted her back, she would come running. But tonight had proved otherwise. Eleanor had moved on. She had rebuilt her life, her career, her confidence. Without him, Jonathan set the glass down, running a hand through his hair. He had made so many mistakes, but this was the one he would never forgive himself for. Over the next few weeks, things went from bad to worse. The media caught wind of his financial troubles. His board of directors was beginning to lose faith in him. Clients were backing out of long-term contracts. The stock market reflected his downfall in real time. And the final blow came when his legal team informed him that his ex-mistress, the woman he had left Eleanor for, was now filing a lawsuit against him. For what? Fraud, financial misconduct, and a personal settlement she claimed he owed her. Jonathan Ashford, the man who once had it all, was now fighting to keep what little he had left. One evening, he finally caved. He picked up his phone and dialed the number he had sworn never to call again. Eleanor. His heart pounded as the line rang once, twice, the third time, and then, "The number you are trying to reach is no longer in service." Jonathan's chest tightened. She had cut him off completely. No contact, no lingering connection, nothing. For the first time in his entire life, Jonathan felt utterly alone. He had left Eleanor believing she was the problem, that she was the reason he felt unfulfilled, that she was holding him back from the life he wanted. But standing here, alone, disgraced and drowning in his own choices, he realized Eleanor was never the problem. He was. She had given him everything. Her love, her loyalty, her trust, and he had destroyed it. Now she was free, and Jonathan Ashford was nothing more than a cautionary tale. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken words, lingering regrets, and the weight of everything that had gone wrong. Ethan sat in his lavish penthouse, nursing a glass of whiskey as he stared out at the city skyline. The glow of the neon lights flickered against the glass, casting distorted reflections of the man he had become. For the first time in years, he didn't feel powerful. He didn't feel invincible. Instead, he felt hollow, like a ghost wandering through the life he had built for himself, only to realize it had been constructed on nothing but sand. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply as he thought about Olivia and the kids. The news of Olivia's growing success had reached his ears through business circles, and he couldn't believe how far she had come. His ex-wife, the woman he had left in the dust, had built an empire of her own. She was being invited to the same exclusive social events he attended, spoken about in the same hushed, reverent tones as other influential business figures. But what stung the most wasn't her financial success. It was the knowledge that she had done it without him. For so long, Ethan had believed she needed him, that she wouldn't survive without his money or influence. And yet, here she was, proving him wrong every single day. The realization gnawed at him, a bitter taste settling in the back of his throat. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He frowned, setting down his drink before making his way over. When he opened the door, he was greeted by the last person he expected to see, his former business partner, Graham Westwood. Graham was a shark in the business world, a man who rarely made social calls unless there was something in it for him. He stood there in his perfectly tailored suit, a smirk playing on his lips as he eyed Ethan with knowing amusement. "Surprised to see me?" Graham asked, stepping inside without an invitation. Ethan closed the door behind him, crossing his arms. "I wasn't expecting company." "Well, I couldn't resist," Graham replied smoothly, strolling over to the bar and helping himself to a drink. "It's not every day I get to witness a king lose his crown." Ethan's jaw clenched. "If you came here to gloat, save your breath." Graham chuckled, swirling the amber liquid in his glass before taking a sip. "Relax, Ethan. I'm just here to talk. You see, I've been keeping an eye on things. On you, on Olivia, on everything that's unfolded over the past few years, and I have to say it's quite the spectacle. Watching your ex-wife rise from the ashes while your business is struggling." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "My business isn't struggling." Graham smirked. "Come on, Ethan, we both know that's not true. Investors are pulling out, your stock value has been taking hits, and your public image, well, let's just say people love a good scandal. A man who left his family for a younger woman, only to watch his empire crumble? It's a story straight out of a Shakespearean tragedy." Ethan's grip tightened on the back of the chair in front of him. "Why are you really here?" Graham leaned in, his smirk widening. "Because I have an offer, a deal that could help you regain what you've lost, at least in business. See, Olivia is expanding rapidly. Her brand is becoming a powerhouse, and guess what? I want a piece of that success, and I think you do too." Ethan scoffed, shaking his head. "You expect me to go crawling back to Olivia for a business deal? You think she'd even entertain the idea? Graham shrugged. Maybe not. But you and I both know Olivia is practical. She's not the same woman you left. She makes calculated decisions, and if partnering with you benefits her financially, she might consider it. And let's be honest, you need this partnership more than she does. The mere suggestion made Ethan's stomach turn. He didn't want Olivia's charity, nor did he want to approach her like some desperate man begging for scraps. But Graham wasn't wrong. His business was bleeding, and if he didn't do something soon, he would lose everything. You should think about it, Graham continued, finishing his drink. Because whether you like it or not, Olivia is no longer the woman waiting in your shadow. She's standing in the light now, and if you don't find a way to step back in, you'll be left behind. With that, Graham placed his empty glass on the bar and walked out, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts. The next day, Ethan sat in his office, his mind a battlefield of conflicting emotions. The logical part of him knew that Graham was right. If he wanted to salvage his business, he needed to swallow his pride. But the personal side of him, the part that still harbored guilt and regret, hated the idea of approaching Olivia under these circumstances. Still, he knew what he had to do. Later that evening, Ethan found himself standing outside Olivia's corporate headquarters, staring up at the gleaming building that bore her name. He had watched this empire grow from a distance, never expecting to be at its doors, asking for an opportunity. Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside. The receptionist greeted him with polite professionalism, though he could see the flash of recognition in her eyes. His reputation preceded him. "I have a meeting with Olivia," he said, keeping his voice steady. "She's expecting you," the receptionist replied, directing him toward the elevator. Ethan's heart pounded as he rode the elevator up to Olivia's office. When the doors opened, he stepped into a sleek, modern space that exuded power and confidence. And there, sitting behind a grand desk, was Olivia. She looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "Ethan." "Olivia," he greeted, stepping forward. "Thank you for seeing me." She leaned back in her chair, studying him carefully. "I was curious, to say the least. It's not every day my ex-husband walks into my office. What do you want, Ethan?" He took a deep breath, knowing there was no easy way to say it. "I want to propose a business deal." Olivia raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement dancing in her eyes. "A business deal? My company is struggling," he admitted, forcing himself to be honest. "I know that partnering with you could be beneficial for both of us. We built things together once. I believe we can do it again." A silence stretched between them, thick with history. Olivia tapped her fingers against the desk, then slowly stood, walking toward the floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the city. "You know, Ethan," she began, her voice thoughtful, "there was a time when I would have given anything to hear those words from you, to know that you valued what we had built together. But now I don't need you." The words stung, but Ethan remained silent. She turned back to face him, her gaze sharp. "However, I am not a woman who lets personal emotions get in the way of business. If you can offer me something worth my time, I'll consider it." Ethan nodded. "You won't regret it." "We'll see," she replied, her lips curling into a knowing smirk. As Ethan left her office, he couldn't shake the feeling that, for the first time in years, he was no longer the one in control. Olivia held all the power now, and he was the one standing in her shadow. And that realization terrified him. Ethan sat in his car outside Olivia's corporate headquarters, gripping the steering wheel tightly. The conversation he had just had with his ex-wife replayed in his mind, each word cutting deeper than the last. She didn't need him. She had built something entirely on her own, something even stronger than what they had once shared. And now, he was the one asking for a seat at the table. The humiliation stung. But more than that, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, powerless. Taking a deep breath, he pulled out his phone and dialed Graham's number. "She agreed to consider the deal," Ethan said the moment Graham picked up. There was a pause on the other end before Graham chuckled. "So you finally swallowed your pride. I have to say, Ethan, it's refreshing to see you being the one chasing after her for once." Ethan gritted his teeth. "This isn't about personal feelings, it's about business." "Right," Graham replied, unconvinced. "Either way, Olivia isn't going to make this easy for you. She's in control now, and she knows it." Ethan ran a hand down his face, already feeling the weight of what he had to do next. He wasn't used to playing by someone else's rules, but if he wanted to save what was left of his business, he had no choice. The following week, Ethan received an email from Olivia's assistant, summoning him for a formal business proposal meeting. He had expected negotiations, perhaps even some pushback, but nothing could have prepared him for what Olivia had in mind. When he arrived at her office, she was already seated at the head of the conference table, a folder neatly placed in front of her. Several of her top executives sat beside her, their expressions unreadable. Ethan took a seat, adjusting his cufflinks to hide his unease. "I looked over your proposal," Olivia began, her voice calm but firm, "and I have a counteroffer." Ethan leaned forward, bracing himself. "Let's hear it." Olivia slid the folder across the table. "I'm willing to invest in your company, but on my terms." Ethan flipped open the folder, scanning the documents. His heart clenched when he realized what she was offering: majority ownership. "You want controlling interest?" he asked, his voice laced with disbelief. Olivia tilted her head slightly, as if she were amused by his reaction. "I do." Ethan clenched his jaw. "That's not a partnership, that's a takeover." "You're free to decline," Olivia said with a slight shrug. "But I don't think you're in a position to negotiate, are you?" Graham, who had accompanied Ethan, leaned back in his chair with a smirk. "Cold, ruthless. I have to say, Olivia, I respect the move." Ethan glared at him before turning back to Olivia. "You want to take over the company I built?" "You didn't build it alone," she reminded him. "And let's be honest, Ethan, you're drowning. I'm offering you a lifeline." Ethan's pride burned inside him. This wasn't just a business decision. This was personal. Olivia wasn't just trying to save his company. She was proving a point. She was proving that she had won. He exhaled sharply, considering his options. He could refuse and watch his company collapse, or he could accept and become a spectator in what was once his own empire. "Give me time to consider," he finally said, pushing the folder back toward her. Olivia studied him for a moment before nodding. "You have 48 hours. Ethan left the building feeling like the walls were closing in on him. He had spent years believing he was untouchable, that he had made the right choice when he walked away from Olivia. But now he was realizing that karma was coming full circle. That evening, Ethan drowned himself in work, trying to find any possible alternative to Olivia's offer. But every option led to the same conclusion. He needed her help. And worse, he realized he didn't just need her for business. He needed her in a way he hadn't before. He had taken her for granted once, assuming she would always be there, that she would always love him no matter what he did. But now he saw what he had lost. The next day, he sat in his penthouse, staring at the contract Olivia had given him. He could sign it and give her control, or he could walk away with nothing. His phone rang. It was Olivia. Taking a deep breath, he answered. "I assume you're calling for my decision." "I am," she replied. There was a pause. Ethan exhaled. "I'll sign it." Silence. Then Olivia spoke, her voice carrying something almost imperceptible. "Good choice." The deal was finalized the next day. Ethan sat across from Olivia as he signed over control of his company, his signature sealing his fate. When he placed the pen down, he met Olivia's gaze, searching for any sign of victory in her expression. But there was none. She didn't gloat, she didn't smirk. She simply nodded and stood. "I hope you find something worth holding on to, Ethan." And with that, she left. Ethan sat there, realizing that even though he had lost his company, he had lost something far greater long ago. Her. Betrayal comes with a price, and sometimes the one who walks away ends up losing the most. Olivia's strength turned her pain into power, proving that success is the best revenge. What do you think of her bold move? Let us know in the comments.